View runs as a volumetric plugin. I'm just going to create a new scene, and we have a couple of things that are added in. Now I'm going to go ahead and just change the way my materials are showing up. What we can see is an environment object with an xStream texture tag added to it. Now, this texture tag is not to be edited, and it's just basically there to represent the volume. If you move this to any other object, then the scene won't render anymore. So we can see this material showing up in our list of materials where we have View 7 xStream. So this is something you want to leave alone, and it is a proxy material. We have a couple of other objects as well that were created because we just have a default scene. The sunlight, main camera, and ground. And anytime you create a new scene or load in a scene, these will pretty much be created unless there's no ground object in the scene or no sunlight. We also have another material, or another proxy material that's created, and this is the view object material. And what this is for is the ground. So our ground object with this proxy material on it. The proxy materials are also not to be edited. They're there strictly for OpenGL purposes. Editing the proxy material will not edit the material itself. For that, you need to use the material editor through xStream. You'll also notice that we have a red dot showing up the ground here within the objects panel, and that is setting this object to not render because it is a proxy object. This volume that will be rendering for the ground is all within xStream, and this object is strictly here for display and editing. So if we were to turn this on, it would render the proxy material with the scene, and in most cases the volumetric rendering of the view scene will overwrite that, but that can still cause some issues. I'm going to go ahead and create just a standard terrain, and we can also see that this terrain has been created with the material tag the exact same as the ground, because by default we have the same material added from the previous selection, and both of these materials will be called default, and it's set to not render in the scene. If you want to switch to the main camera, click on the icon next to main camera, and whether or not that switch is immediate is defined in the xStream options. So you can go up to the top and go to File, Options, or I'm just going to use my button here to open this up. And we can see down in the bottom in Miscellaneous, switch viewport to view camera upon creation. And that will automatically go ahead and check that on so you're looking through the view main camera. There are quite a few options within this panel, and some really important ones too. If we take a look at the top, we have Incorporate View Scene into Cinema 4D file. This is for whether or not we want to separate the two scenes. We could have just the view scene as a separate file from the Cinema 4D scene. If you're going to be using this method of incorporating the files together, I strongly recommend that before you load in any view elements into a scene, if you already have one created within Cinema, that you make sure you have a separate file already saved without the view scene, and make sure you have a backup first before you go ahead and overwrite it. Just in case anything happens with the plugin, it might corrupt the entire file and not just the view portion of it. The units and scale options can vary quite a bit. We're going to take a look more in depth at these settings a little later, just because a lot of it really will depend on the settings you already have within View, and of course the settings you have within Cinema. But for right now, I'm just going to stay with the automatic mode. If you're loading a scene or creating a new scene with a cinema scene already, so in other words, creating a new view scene or loading in a view scene, if you already have a sunlight established, there's an option to match the view sun with the existing sun. And we have some display options for the proxy objects, adjusting the geometry quality, lower, high, and then also ecosystem instances. And we'll take a look at those a little bit later. But the infinite plane geometry size, basically a single polygon that is created for our ground. And if you were to create a water object, it would also be an infinite plane. And if you're using any other mode other than the spectral mode, when you create a cloud plane, it will also be an infinite plane object represented with a single polygon. So this setting is to select the initial geometry size of that object. In most cases, the scale really doesn't matter because it's flat. The position, of course, will. And then we have some other rendering options in here, and we'll take a look at those a little bit later. So I'm going to go ahead and just click OK. And because of the current scale difference, it can be a little difficult to kind of see the grid. I am going to add in a construction plane with the settings. Take a look. We have grid spacing at 100 centimeters, lines 100, and major lines every 10. So this will make it a little bit easier to kind of see where we're at within the scene. Now, if we take a look at this terrain, what we have is a proxy object. It is set not to render within the scene. And if we go ahead and render this out, we can see the volume showing up, the volumetric part of xStream rendering. So if I was to go ahead and make it render, what we're going to see is a lot of artifacts and the two objects mixing together. So basically we have the proxy object now rendering within the scene. So if you ever see any sort of distortion like this, and that's a problem, then what you can do is just double check within the objects panel and make sure that that render is set off. And all you have to do is click on the button twice, and that'll set it showing as red, not to render. And if you want to turn off the display within the OpenGL, you can click the top one. Now for the best display quality, if you go up to display, you want to make sure that you turn on enhanced OpenGL. This is really going to affect the way plants show up more than it is terrains, but it'll also adjust the lighting a little bit, and that can be pretty important. Another thing to keep in mind, because I have run into a slight issue with this, is the sunlight and whether or not it's pointing at the camera. What we can do is select the sunlight, and I have, of course, these options already set up in my right-click menu, but basically you want to go to Object Properties. This can also be found under the main menu and under Object, where we have Object Properties towards the bottom of the list. So with the sunlight selected, go to Object Properties and make sure that Point at Camera is turned off. Otherwise, I have noticed quite frequently that what will happen is the sunlight will move around a lot, kind of resetting, adjusting the orientation, and whether or not that it is a bug right now, whether or not you have that bug with your current version, you'll really have to check and see. But for the most part, you really don't need that option on, and it's really going to cause more problems because that option is really intended for the standalone version of Vue. So turning that off is preferred. So if we take a look at this terrain, and now I'm going to go to our options and set our geometry quality to low, we're going to see that is going to reduce the amount of polygons on our proxy object. So if you're working with a higher pixel amount, so if we go ahead and select our terrain, edit the object, and up at the top we have our size. 256 by 256 is the default. That, of course, can be changed by creating a terrain in editor. We'll just go ahead and cancel this really quick. And if we go to terrain in editor, we can set the terrain size, width, and height, and that is going to set up the default for all the terrains you create. So go ahead and edit the object to open up the terrain editor, and I'm going to hit the ×2 button to double the size, and we can see that the geometry looks pretty much the same. Bring it up a little bit higher, and the proxy does change slightly because increasing the resolution does change and alter some of the finer details, but for the most part it's still not very complex. If you really need to get high resolution, set the geometry quality to high in the xStream options, and now you're going to have pretty decent quality proxy. Edit the object, go ahead and increase it even higher, and in this case it doesn't look like it really went beyond any of the current settings. Go ahead and generate a mountain and see how that's going to look. Now if you want to find out the exact polygon amount, you can right mouse click on the object within the Objects panel and go to Object Information, and now we can see we have 133,000 polygons and just a little over 400,000 points. So I'm going to go back and edit the object, just reset it. I'm going to lower the resolution, create a mountain. Now we can see that showing up. And we're going to take a look at just how we can edit these objects. Basically, any sort of modification of the three primary deformations, meaning position, rotation, and size, can all be edited directly within Cinema. Now, in order for this to work, we do need to make sure that we're in the object mode. Model mode, not going to work. If we take a look, and I'm going to go ahead and switch to size, scaling it is not going to change anything. So we go to the object mode, and now we can scale. And I have the rotation and scale and position all in a hotkey. So I'm going to be changing these, and you'll see me change those very quickly because I'm using hotkeys, in case you were wondering. So we can move this around. And if we take a look, we're going to see the terrain has changed. Go ahead and we can scale that down, and that will modify and update between the plugin, volumetric, and cinema. And this is mainly what these proxy objects are for, is just arranging the scene. Any of the other modifiers we could use within cinema are not going to work. They will affect the proxy object, but they will not affect the final render. So if we were to take any of the transformations, twist or bend, although it will show up on the proxy, it will not manipulate the object itself or the final render. And I'm going to load in an object material, which we can use the change object material command, and that's under object. And what we can do is load in any of the materials you have in the view browser, any collections that are loaded in, and these settings will be exactly the same as your standalone collections that are loaded in. So let's go to landscapes, and I'm going to select the gray mountain rocks. And under the display, I just want to make sure I also turn on transparency. And this is going to be helpful for displaying ecosystems or plants, mainly the plants themselves, not so much the ecosystem. So now if we take a look, we can see we have a new material added, a new proxy material. And we can go ahead and select that, and we're going to see it's called View Object Material. So they're all pretty much called that. So anytime you see View Object Material, know that that's within the scene and it's not a material you can edit. What we can see is it is used to generate our OpenGL preview of the color. So we have a texture map that is loaded in automatically, and these are all in a temporary directory. If we select to load in a different texture, we'll be able to see the directory of all the temporary files that are created. Texture map, any sort of ecosystem proxy that we're going to see, all of those files will show up in here, or if we're opening in the standalone version, those files will all be available in this folder. Now, unfortunately, at least if you're a Windows user, this will be in the local settings of the user account that is logged in, which means it's going to be on the same hard drive more than likely as the operating system. With larger scenes, a lot of files that might reduce performance, just because typically you want to keep your content on a different hard drive than the operating system. So this automatically puts everything on the operating system drive, which might reduce performance a little. For the most part, it shouldn't. They're pretty small files, and in most cases, unless you're using a lot of texture maps, you really shouldn't run into any problems with that. I'm going to add an ecosystem to this material. We can go to Edit Object Material to open up the material editor for this current material. I'm going to add a layer and just hit the X. Technically, all I really need to do is just hit Ecosystem, which would automatically add the correct layer. So I'm going to go back, hit Ecosystem, and we could just delete that gray layer we had. I'm going to rename this Ecosystem, and we can rename the primary material name Terrain. I'm going to go ahead and add in a plant. and we'll select a couple of different ranges of scale and quality. Go ahead and use the rural maple tree, which is one of the older plants, and let's select one of the new high-res vegetation files. We have the large European ash. Some of the newer files or the more complex ones will take a little bit longer to load in, and we can see an operation in progress window showing up, and what it's doing is basically generating some of the OpenGL previews so that we'll be able to see them within the interface, and it's performing other actions as well. So some of the larger files may take a little bit longer to load in. And let's go ahead and add in a rock object as well. And I'm just going to select no for the color variations. Now, if you're used to working with the standalone version, you're probably used to getting an immediate preview of the ecosystem. Unfortunately, within xStream, we have proxy panels. These panels store information, and then when the OK button is clicked, that information is transferred to the scene. Or if we hit the X, it is canceled. But we're not going to get an immediate response. Go ahead and click populate. Right now, 0 instances, probably because of the overall scale. I'm going to check the environment tab first, and what we can see is because of some of the settings within the previous layer, even though there is no environment tab, it has affected the creation of this layer. So I'm going to turn off our fuzziness options and adjust the altitude and slope ranges, repopulate, and now we can see we have 12 instances. So the best way to really see what we're going to end up with before we click OK is by looking at the amount of instances that are created. Let's go ahead and start with that. Click OK, and now we can see those objects within the scene. And because we have such a complex object here for our proxy with the terrain, and that selection can be a little distracting with how dense it is, I'm going to go ahead and replace this basically with procedural terrain, but not using the replace object, just creating a new procedural terrain object with having this one selected, so it should transfer the material over. And it did, because now it's asking if we'd like the ecosystem to be automatically populated. I'm going to click yes. It's going to populate our ecosystem, and now what we can do is select the terrain in the first object we had, not the procedural terrain, and just hit delete, which will delete that object. We'll select our procedural terrain, and it looks like there's a little bit of a draw error. So what I'm going to do is right mouse click, edit the object, and now we can see that terrain showing up. Turn off 0 edges, just so we don't have that mountain look. Click OK. And now we can see the terrain showing up. Whenever you modify a terrain, you will need to repopulate unless you're using dynamic population. So what we can do is edit the object material, populate, and we'll be able to see that ecosystem showing up. I'm going to go ahead and scale this a little bit larger, which is also going to scale the ecosystem instances until you repopulate if you're not using dynamic population. Repopulate, and we can see the trees showing up and some of the rocks. So our display quality is really fairly low For instances, really we get the billboard look. And if we go back to the xStream options, we can see we have the ability to limit the number of ecosystem instance proxies, because every single one of these would be considered a proxy. Every single instance of every object that's loaded into the ecosystem. When it starts to get to higher numbers, hundreds of thousands or even tens of thousands, that can reduce performance in cinema. So you can adjust this amount as needed. And I'm just going to load in a plant from species. And we can take a look at the OpenGL preview of a regular plant, and one that's not connected to an ecosystem, because it is going to look a little bit different. And another thing you have to keep in mind is if you are used to working with the standalone a lot, Cinema is not going to automatically select the newest object created. So you may have to go in and select that object, but you can still use commands like drop object, and that'll go ahead and drop this onto the terrain. And you should be able to use that with cinema objects as well. We'll go ahead and give that a try later. So let's take a look, and we can see the display quality of this tree. Now this one has a rather strange OpenGL preview, and it's like that for the standalone version as well, because it is a really complex high geometry plant. If we take a look and edit the object to open the plant editor, we can see we have 364,000 polygons. So it's a rather complex object. So that our display of it and our preview is not going to be full resolution, and in this case, not really even close to it. We'll go ahead and load in another plant, and we should be able to get a better display of, let's go ahead and use the broadleaf straight trunk. And now it's going to generate our new materials for this object. So we'll select that new broadleaf. We can move that off to the side. And I can already see that my performance is going slightly down because of the amount of texture maps showing up. And if we change our display, turning off transparency, my performance is severely increased, yet we can still see transparency. It's just the shading of it is a little bit off. So maybe in this case, when you have a lot of static plants that are not part of an ecosystem, it might be easier just to turn off that transparency option, because when you have a lot of objects in the scene, that's probably going to cause some issues. Also, the shadow mode doesn't really seem to work because these proxy objects are not real polygons, and it's not really programmed into the program or to be integrated in, kind of like how we would create just a standard object in Cinema, where we would modify it first and then make it editable to turn that into polygons. So it's basically the same thing, except that there's a lot of things that won't work with these proxies. OpenGL preview shadows are one of them. and also some of the dynamic interactions with particles and other objects. Although there are ways to get the proxy to work by creating duplicates, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. Let's go ahead and just try this drop object and see if it works. And it doesn't look like we'll be able to do that with cinema objects. So I'm not sure whether or not that's a bug or a limitation. So it could just be the current version. Give it a try with whatever version you're using and just see if it works or not, because that might be something that is implemented later. But we're going to go back and take a look at the terrain, edit the object material. I'm going to turn on full quality in your camera, and we're going to see that this will not affect the OpenGL. A lot of these settings will not change the preview. So we can go back, edit the object material once again. Let's go ahead and change this to wireframe. And we can see that that is also not changing anything. So basically, the billboard is the standard display for an ecosystem. So this default quality mode is really not going to affect anything. Even setting it to none won't change your display, because those are display settings for the standalone and not xStream. So we'll just set that back to billboard and keep it like that. So if we do open this up in the standalone version, we don't have to worry about a massive scene refresh rate. And if we go back to the display, I'm going to go ahead and change these modes. And only the actual proxy objects, the ones that are being represented with polygons and not ecosystem instances, will be changed. So now we have the hidden line mode. We could set it to lines, constant shading. So that will affect all of our other options, or all of our other objects, which is pretty nice, because then you can set up display qualities for your layers and make modifications that way. It doesn't look like we have smoothing on this surface. And the geometry quality of this procedural terrain is fairly low. So another thing to keep in mind is procedural terrains, for the most part, are going to be lower quality than standard terrains within the OpenGL, and even editing the object and increasing the pixel resolution typically does not update the quality. Although in this case, it does look like it added a bit of a Phong shader and refreshed the preview since we were changing display modes. So this is what the scene currently looks like with low quality render. And we're going to go more in depth with the render settings because there are a couple of things you really should know from the xStream options, and also just what really renders within the volumetric and what doesn't. Because there's just some things that cinema controls and some things that view controls, and different ways to separate that as well. I do want to make a note about these proxy materials. Saving them really won't do you any good. For the most part, they're connected to the xStream plugin. Once that plugin is closed, then all of those are going to disappear. Another thing too is when you bake a proxy object, which is possible, it acts as a delete command in view. So it will remove the object from the view portion of the scene, but you'll still have the proxy. Once you do that, the view object materials will also disappear and no longer be connected to the proxy. And saving the proxy materials typically isn't reliable because of the temporary folder that they're stored in. whether or not that refreshes or is deleted with new scenes. That can change with system settings and versions, but for the most part that will be kind of unreliable. So if you're ever going to turn anything into a proxy, or take a proxy, turn it into polygons, then you need to make sure that you're creating a copy first, pasting it, and we're going to take a look at that later, where we go ahead and modifying the proxy object and using them for dynamic interaction with the scene.